Today, we're going to talk about how to get your club on the radio. The radio is a great way of reaching a wide audience, but we don't exploit it as a Toastmaster Club and Toastmasters organization. We are very lucky today to have a star of radio. It is a fallacy that the video killed the radio stars, as Buggles predicted back in the 1980s. Andy Hessey has worked in radio for many years. He's also a very experienced Toastmaster. He was president on multiple occasions and VPE at Berkhamsted Speakers for a long time. He was Area J4 director for a couple of years ago, and his current main role in Toastmasters is as president of Pegasus Advanced Speakers in District 71. He's also recently finished a stint as a morning breakfast presenter for a local radio station here in Buckinghamshire. Andy has also previously talked about how to get advertising to work on the radio for Toastmaster clubs, but today he's going to focus on how to get free access to appear in editorial slots. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Andy Hessey.
Diane, thank you very much, and a very good afternoon to everybody. It struck me yesterday as I was preparing for this that next week is actually the 30th anniversary of me first being on the radio back in Christmas 1991. That is incredibly scary. So this afternoon, what I'm going to talk about is how to get yourself on the radio. And it might seem that it's a fairly simple process, but actually there needs to be a bit of thought going into this. And yes, it is a straightforward process, but you just need to target correctly and think about what your angles are. What I want to do firstly is fairly quickly, I just want to run through this. If I just start my slideshow. Not all radio stations are the same, is a good way of starting. So you have various different types of radio stations, and you're not going to be able to get on every single type of radio station for various reasons. And once you understand how radio in the UK works and some of the philosophies behind it, then it makes it much easier to work out which radio stations you can target. So if you bear with me while I just share my screen. He says. Stupid thing. Zoom is not playing ball with me today, which is excellent. Right, hopefully you can see this. Yeah, got thumbs up from Dan, thank you. So there is almost an inverted pyramid when it comes to UK radio. It's not always been quite so clear cut, certainly for the vast majority of the 70s, 80s, and the majority of the 90s, it was a fairly flat structure. What you have at the top of the pyramid is national radio. And these guys are your big stations, your classic FMs, your talk sports, your Radio 1s. They are very unlikely to want to have somebody just coming in and talking about Toastmasters. The exception to this may be Radio 5. However, again, very difficult to get into, and the message would probably get lost because it would be to such a wide audience. So this is very much a national broadcaster. These are going to be very big audiences, and your message is going to get drowned out. You've then got something which we've only had for the last 10-15 years or so, and these are quasi-national stations. These are radio stations that broadcast to a large proportion of the country, but are not technically national radio stations. So you have Heart, Capital, Greatest Hits Radio. I feel very unclean about talking about these people. I have had many run-ins with them in terms of my opinion of what they do to commercial radio in the UK. Also, quasi-national stations are almost exclusively going to be entertainment-led. They are commercial ventures that aim to make money by playing music, and that's it. You're lucky if you get news on there, quite frankly. So there is absolutely no way you're going to get anything onto those stations. Next, you've got regional radio, which are large-scale stations. These cover generally a couple of counties, maybe 2 or 3 counties. These are predominantly music-led. They do have more local content to them than the quasi-nationals. So we have Wave 105, which covers Hampshire and Sussex, Downtown, which covers pretty much the whole of Ulster, and Gen 106, which covers Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire, and Derbyshire. So these are larger scale stations, probably wouldn't have the kind of programming that you would be able to guest on, but they are certainly more local. You've then got ILR, which is independent local radio. This is essentially how commercial radio started back in the 1970s. These are going to be very much city-based or maybe one county. They are much smaller audience, and they tend to provide a lot more of your community-based events. They still primarily music-driven, but they would have far more in the way of local information. KMFM, Pirate FM. Isle of Wight Radio is actually quite an interesting one, because that is that has a lot of very localized coverage. Given the island's a fairly small little place, it's amazing the amount of local content they can provide, and they've been, for a station that size, incredibly successful since they launched back in 1992. These 4 elements, you're probably not going to get an awful lot of traction. When it comes to the BBC, they would be classed in a similar band to regional radio, but in terms of their opportunities, I'll talk about those in a minute, but they are significantly better to get into. So then you have your community radio stations, and community radio is where it's at the moment in terms of not only the growth of radio, but also in terms of actually the output they are providing to their communities. So there are currently 316 licensed community radio stations around the UK, which is more than all of your national stations, your quasis, your regionals, and your ILRs put together about 3 times over. And these are generally small town operations. For a medium-sized city, you may have 2 or 3 of these. For a large city like London, there are about 25 or 30. And community radio is the biggest growing area in radio. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of the main ones is that, quite frankly, people are sick and tired of the dross that Heart and Capital put out. They are fed up with hearing the same 30 songs over and over again during the day. And I make no apologies for Heart bashing. They deserve it. But community radio often has different styles of programming. Certainly when I was working for Wickham Sound, the breakfast show was predominantly a music-based show, but the daytime shows were a mixture of music and guests. And the guests are really, really important on community radio stations. They help give a certain amount of depth to the station. And another reason that listeners are really starting to tune into commercial radio is because the guests often enhance the locality of the station. So there are two factors within this. The first is actually local events. Back when I was with Wycombe Sound, there was a massive fire at an industrial estate in High Wycombe. It was causing all sorts of chaos in the town. Roads were closed, big plumes of smoke were seen billowing up over the industrial estate. The quasi-national station in Aylesbury, which is the closest one to High Wycombe, Greatest Hits Radio, made a cursory mention in their travel bulletin. They said that there was gridlock around High Wycombe because of a fire. That was it. But to the residents of High Wycombe, the fire was actually quite important. It could have ended very badly because of gas cylinders, because of power lines. Wycombe Sound were on the scene. They had a person stood by the police cordon, constantly phoning back into the station, giving updates. They had the local police on to talk about the traffic. They had representatives from the business park that the fire was on to talk about the kind of businesses that were affected there. They made the story really, really local and really personal to Wycombe. The other element is making a national story a local focus. A lot of times during the COVID outbreak, community radio stations, not just Wycombe Sound, but other ones as well, have taken the national issues around mask wearing, around jabs, but made them personal to that area. So talking to nurses in the immunisation centres, talking to people who manufacture masks, who need masks on because of illnesses, making a national story local helps to increase the listeners' awareness of the area, and it makes people feel that they're not just listening to some faceless station, they are listening to a station that's talking to them. So you've got stations like Apple FM, Riviera FM, Voice FM. Some of these stations, you can probably roughly guess where they are. Riviera is down in Torquay, Apple FM is in Somerset. You then have beneath that something called an RSL, which is Restricted Service License. And RSLs are very specialized radio stations. RSLs are short-term radios. When I say short-term, they can be anywhere from about 5 days to about 30. And generally, most stations will be on a 20 to 28 day basis. And you may be thinking, well, what's the point of having a radio station for 20 days or so? A lot of the time, these are incredibly specific stations. They are set up with an absolute purpose. One of the first RSLs was set up in 1991. And some people may be aware of a guy called the Reverend Steve Chalk. And Steve Chalk set up a number of organizations, one of which was Tier Fund, and the other one which was Radio Cracker. And these were 28-day licenses where small towns could broadcast charity radio stations. They were fundraisers, effectively, for Christian charities. You didn't have to be religious to work on them, but that was the principle. And RSLs had never really been trialled before 1991. Nobody knew how they were going to work, but they became really, really popular. As I mentioned at the very beginning, it's my 30th anniversary of working in radio, and Radio Cracker was where I started. In actual fact, Rugby Radio Cracker, which was my station, is one of the only stations now from that original 30-year period. Most kind of died off after a few years. But RSLs are really, really popular. As well as Christmas RSLs, Radio Cracker, you have Ramadan Radio. So a number of licenses are created for Ramadan stations, places like Wolverhampton, Leeds, Bradford. And stations like that broadcast to the Muslim community. They will have religious prayers, they will have religious music and religious conversation as well. You also have Air FM, which is for Eastbourne and Bournemouth air shows. So they're only on for a couple of days, and Wimbledon radio as well during the tennis tournament. And these are brilliant opportunities because they are short term, but people will listen to them. People want them for information. People want them for very specific types of culture or very specific types of local broadcasting. And these are, again, potentially great audience areas that you can tap into. The next one is student radio, and we've all come across students and their exploits. Well, student radio is still a big thing. In fact, it's even bigger than it was when I was around in the 1990s. You've got a lot of stations now, very, very professional stations, and a number of people that go from student radio to either the BBC or to large radio stations. For those people who are around in the South Coast, Pat Sissons, who is the mid-morning presenter on BBC Solent, was with me at Siren FM back in 1995 in Southampton, and we had many interesting experiences there, but we worked together a number of times, and Pat's now a fully fledged radio presenter. It could happen. Finally, internet radio are stations that have no real geographical fix. They are available wherever you have the internet. But a lot of these are either community-based stations in terms of they will have lots of niche features, or they're just widely accessible. Spin and Chat is a great little radio station that they pretty much put anybody on air that asks to go on air. You get a 5 to 6 minute slot. You basically give your pitch and that's it. And they have a reasonable audience. So again, these are stations that you can certainly think about. It's this bottom half then that, as a Toastmaster looking to get exposure, this is the kind of area that you want to be looking at. So you want to be looking at your communities, your RSLs, and your student radio stations. So let's talk about how to get that slot. Firstly, it's about understanding the station. So you need to make a decision about which station or stations you wish to target. If you want to target a small community radio station, then brilliant. If you want to target a BBC station, it's the same process essentially. You need, firstly, to understand the station. There's no point just rocking up saying, hey, I want to talk about Toastmasters. You need to understand where you would fit in to the station. As I said, on Wickham Sound, they have 2 shows, one at 10 o'clock and one at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, where it's a mixture of guests and music. So those would be the kind of slots that you would want. But you need to do a little bit more digging. You need to appreciate the kind of guests they have, how long these slots are, how many slots they have during the shows. So you need to listen for potentially a couple of weeks just to get familiar. And also, targeting a particular show allows you to get to know the presenter as well, to start to understand what they like, to understand how they ask the questions, to understand how formal or informal these interviews are. There are many presenters that, even though they are community or BBC radio stations, are very formal in the way that they interview. And there are some people that are so relaxed relaxed. It's just like chatting to your mate. But you need to find a presenter and a station that is going to match your style, because otherwise the interview is just going to sound a bit kind of stretched. So find the person that you want, find the style that you want, and then think about actually what you need to say, how you want to come across, and what you want to do. And then, rather than going straight to the presenter, talk to the boss, have a chat to the boss. If they're a local station, you can probably meet them for a cup of coffee. Have a chat on Zoom or Teams or whatever, and get to know how they decide what goes on their station. It may well be that the presenter has complete autonomy and they just say, go and talk to the presenter. Great, that's fine, if that's the case. But if you've spoken to the boss and you've started to build up a bit of a relationship with the boss, it makes it much easier then to be able to approach the presenters and go, I've spoken to your program controller. He said, come and talk to you. Just by saying you've already spoken to the boss, it smooths out the passage, right? And quite often, the people that are the bosses are also the presenters. So, especially on small commercial radio stations, they also have a show during the day. Once you start to build up this relationship, it's really, really important that you start to carry this relationship on. This shouldn't just be a one-off hit. It should be a continuous relationship, because at the end of the day, they can help provide Toastmasters with a lot of free coverage, and making that relationship last is going to be important. So you've made the relationship, you've got a slot. What are you going to talk about? What's the point of doing this in the first place? There's a number of different reasons for wanting to be a guest. We have our 4 membership building periods a year, and that is an absolutely ideal time to talk about Toastmasters. What are you doing in your club? What are you planning on doing in the next couple of months? Why should you become a member? Diane is about to disappear in 5 minutes or so to an open house. Well, open house, brilliant. Have you ever heard of Toastmasters? No, come along to our open house. And again, it doesn't matter if you do 2 or 3 open houses a year. Just by doing the radio, you've potentially increased your audience significantly, and 1 or 2 guests by the law of probabilities are likely to come from this. There are lots of different ways that you can promote your clubs by being guests. But then you can also take it a step further. And more commonly, this would be on BBC local radio, but you do still get this on community radio, is where you end up going from being a recurring guest to being an expert. Many, many people here will know Sam Warner, who is a very experienced Toastmaster in D91. And Sam is effectively the resident autism guest at BBC Shropshire. She's built the relationship so much with the team there that she is now called upon whenever there's a local angle needed on autism. And it's because she's gone from doing these guest appearances, she's built up the relationship. And again, it does to an extent depend on the management of the station. I happen to have worked with the managing editor of Reed Shropshire. Lovely, lovely guy. Couldn't get a nicer guy. And he is always very interested in having locally based people. So building up this relationship and showing that you're coming into an interview with some really good ideas, some really good stories to tell, can lead on to being an expert in another field, not just public speaking. And it can open up brand new opportunities for you outside of Toastmasters, as well as helping your Toastmasters club. There are BBC local radio stations all over England. The equivalent is BBC Wales and BBC Scotland. But BBC local radio is a bit of a funny beast. There's no denying that. But they do like their local stories, and they do like their local recurring guests. It adds a familiarity to their listenership. The final point I would like to just reiterate to people, each of these stations will have a slightly different demographic structure, and it's worth trying to just make sure that you are fitting to those demographics. Some of the BBC stations, because of their areas, because of some of their presenters, have a higher age demographic than others. Some of the BBC local radio stations have quite a young set of presenters, some quite young guests, and others, it's all about tea party and whist drives. So you do have to pay attention to what kind of guests are on the station to make sure that you're fitting in with those demographics. Some of the bigger city stations, so BBC WM in Birmingham, BBC London, BBC Manchester, tend to be a slightly younger focused stations purely because of the areas that they serve. Whereas BBC Cornwall is fantastic if you're suffering from insomnia. BBC Cumbria as well is not far behind. Understanding your station before you start to put together a pitch, before you start to put together your interview notes, is vital. But radio can be a fantastic springboard, and it is still a growing medium. 86% of people listen to the radio at least once a week. Those are the figures from the Radio report from October this year. That's a massive, massive audience to get your Toastmaster message out. Thank you very much for listening today. And if you have any questions, I am more than happy to answer them.